So I thought really 3 fascinating papers, some really interesting links between them, particularly around the politics of the cities, the interconnections between small cities and the metropole, and again this pervading question about what is a small city, both the social and the statistical context of small cities. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion, so yes, we have one already.
Hi, I'm Nupur and I'm a PhD student at University of California, Irvine, and I happen to be visiting and I'm very glad to be here. All the presentations are fantastic, and I want to pick up on the last 2 and kind of ask you to elaborate a little bit on, so you already mentioned Gertner, but I think there's something very important to the aspirational thread in the smart city narrative, and if you could speak a little bit more to sort of what I feel on the ground when I go. I study ride-sharing practices in Bangalore and in its peripheries. And what I find interesting is that, at least when speaking to my colleagues in the US, they feel like there's some kind of opposition between unions and private tech companies and local governments and so on and so forth. But in fact, I struggle to sort of make the case that a lot of people are working in the same direction because there's a certain sort of what's in it for me and how do I configure in this smart city that's coming together, whether I like it or not. And it's a very different picture that I see. So if you could speak about the aspirational perspective. And then to the last presentation, while I appreciate your use of Jugaad, I just want to dispute it a little bit and say, well, at least in science studies, for example, I don't think that these are exceptional features. In fact, I mean, there's a little bit written about how Jugaad in itself creates this exceptional narrative of how this isn't infrastructure, how this isn't what it is. And I think that's kind of my investment in disputing the smart city vision in itself, is that I think it doesn't adequately displace the vision of the metropolitan. And how can we then sort of, in the context of South Asia and urban studies, start building a vocabulary for what the South Asian urban and infrastructure looks like? And if you could speak to that as well. Thanks.
David, thank you for that really wonderful historical journey through so many years. It's really helped contextualize. Yeah. A couple of questions on your focus on land, which I think is very important. And the first is an age-old one that so many of us have asked so many times, but I think it's worth putting out there again, is why is it that people's connection with land is seen as somehow more proximate in an agrarian context, whereas in an urban context, people might not till the land, but they still live on it, they build on it, they get their livelihood from it. So why isn't it seen as that proximate as it is in the agrarian context? And a follow-up to that is, then should our current and the continued movement around right to the city be continually referenced at that starting point of people's connection with land? And is the debate around smallness one way to do that?
I've got a sort of really quite banal question, but what do we mean by small with cities? Because I've seen a whole range of I don't know if scalar is necessarily this idea of small being not big, and there's some regionality about it and this sort of contrast. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what the smallness in this discussion is, because I don't think it's necessarily population has been used as a sort of typical thing, but I've seen a whole range of population sizes be characterized as small, and they're right. So is there something else apart from smallness that might better describe this characteristics of these sort of cities that we're talking about?
Panel, over to you.
Do you want to start with the aspiration?
Sure. I think the aspirational element is really interesting because I find that the ways that it comes out is maybe not as expected. So, for example, in the Navsari case with this beautified water body, there was initially no kind of explicit aspiration for that to be a showpiece, but once it was done, it became aspirational in that people started talking about how, like, oh, look at this, we have this beautiful space, it sits in the center of town, it appeared on the banner of Navsari's website. It became this kind of idea of sort of a beautiful and modern town, that we had this space, you know, that was nice to walk and all of these things. It was actually tied up into this kind of long process of transforming the center of town that started in the 60s, where a pond was partially filled and there was a temple built, and then eventually the old pond was lined with concrete to serve as a water reservoir. But I think there's sometimes this idea that the aspirations come first, and in fact, often they come almost after, almost as a kind of tangential thing. In West Bengal, there was a lot less of this kind of aspirational idea. And it kind of interconnects with this idea of small and cities. Often people, you know, I'd explain the project to them and they go, but this isn't a city. You know, this is not a city, this is a town. It's okay, fair enough, but it would, you know, it kind of keep getting brought up. This isn't a city, we're just a small place. You know, these kind of connections to Kolkata would also come out. You know, we're just a small place. Next to Kolkata, we have the most, you know, the most medical infrastructure or something like this. But it was interesting how kind of it was self-identified. In terms of what do we mean by small, in our project we use the Bell and Jane definition, which is towns that are both aspirationally and kind of politically small, and that they have not many aspirations to be big, to be kind of metros. How that played out in the end was not always clear, but.
Sure, I can take up the Jugaad question. Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I agree that the term Jugaad, when it first started to be used in academic discourse, was meant to represent, you know, the absence of infrastructure or improvised infrastructure and such things. But I think there is a potential to reclaim and reappropriate the term. I really like the term because it's organic and it's from popular parlance, and it's such a vivid term. When you use it, people just know what you mean, and yet it has sort of no fixed definition. You know, it could have so many iterations. I think it's a very useful term for understanding the Indian mode of urbanization, or the Indian mode of doing economic activity. So if we could flip that and say, well, Jugaad is the dominant economic mode in India. India is a Jugaad economy where you have some global capitalist presence. I think we could flip that a bit, or some institutionalized formal presence in this otherwise universal Jugaad terrain that is India. So I think there's potential to flip that. So in that sense, I wouldn't take it to be sort of a pejorative connotation necessarily. And I agree that the smart cities narrative, as it comes from the state at the moment, does not displace the metropole narrative at all. It very much reinforces it, and it very much is within the metrocentricity paradigm, where it's trying to get small cities to mimic metropolitan cities. I agree, and I think this project, that's where this project comes in disturbing those received narratives and changing the course of those narratives in some ways. Yeah, I hope that answers it in some ways.
Around Karachi, there's what are called Goths. They're villages, dense villages that have been there for 300 or 400 years. And no one in Karachi has bothered with them. They don't get anything delivered, but they're just ignored. But Karachi expands, the real estate market expands. People who've been living for 400 years, well, not them, their ancestors, are suddenly threatened. They have no documentation. They've been there 400 years, but they have no documentation. And suddenly the power of the real estate to bulldoze them. What's more worrying, the power of the political classes to bulldoze them then becomes evident. And so I suppose that's the worst example of cities where the best examples of cities, I wish there was more literature on Latin America in English, because most municipalities now accept that informal settlements have a right to stay there. Indeed, there was this very moving moment when there was this enormous informal settlement in Buenos Aires downtown that got evicted by the military. When they returned to democracy, they reoccupied it, they reclaimed it. They had no legal right to be there, except that had been their home, and the government accepted it. So in a sense, if we're going to get the right to the city, it's around those politically negotiated compromises that serve and support those that occupy land that they feel is theirs.
Can I add something about the small cities? What is a small city question? Yeah, I think this is a question not only relevant for small cities, but for urbanization overall. What is urban? What is urbanization? And I don't think there is any universally accepted criteria or definition at present where we can say this is when a place is urban. It's as different as 200 population, 200 in Denmark and 5,000 in India and other numbers in other places. I know of one project, the eGeopolis project, which tried to map it, sort of do satellite mapping, and then look at continuous built-up area, and then demarcate those.
But that produced absolute nonsense statistics.
I agree.
Rwanda was suddenly 89% urban.
Yeah, India was some 60-65%, something along those lines. Yeah, so I think it has to be a very relational and very embedded definition of smallness that varies from case to case or context to context. Yeah.
I mean, this definition is something that we will be working on as well. So we just have a few questions now, Ritu, and then...
My question is for both Srilata and Natasha. If small has to become a concept, then probably we need to find a relationship between small and the big in qualitative terms as well, right? So what is that makes small small in qualitative terms with the big? So probably that is to be explored.
I'm interested in some reflections on the value judgments local make with regards to the notion of smallness. One could imagine this going two ways. One, we are not a big city in terms of we don't have all these things. But the other could be this is a local place, this has community, there are no long ways, there's no hassle, it's not a fast life. So I was wondering whether you have any reflections on the experience of people and how they qualify smallness in terms of the value for quality of life.
I think with respect to the smallness and also as a connection to what she said and what Sir said, it's the idea of the identity affiliation with being a small towner. That's a part of everyday assertion in Indian life. I'm a small town girl, my value is this. Suddenly you arrive in a big city and you are in opposition in that city, or that kind of mix of transition, holding on to something while also trying to become modern. I think those tensions through the people who are mobile, and in a lot of cities we're also seeing people from big cities are now coming back to the small ones and bringing the ideas, the knowledge, but customizing it to local taste and local values. So one example I'll give you in this. I was doing narratives in Guwahati, and old Guwahati city, which is closer to the banks of Brahmaputra. And when I arrived there, I was doing memory narratives of people in terms of what has changed in the city. And that's very interesting, but I won't go into the details. One thing that I noticed was there was suddenly a lot of European bakery in the old lane, right? Every bakery is European cuisine. So I was like, Assamese people hold on to Assamese Sanskriti quite a bit in terms of everyday, assertions. And yet here the taste and the palate is now, a bit more European. When you enter those bakery, you find, in some bakery you would find Hendrix, pop, or different kinds. It reflects the taste of the person, the owner also. So I started interviewing the owners, and they said because now only old people, most of the people in this area are actually old, and their kids are abroad, or they are in Bombay or somewhere where they have become accustomed to those tastes. So when the grandchildren come to the town, their grandparents want them to feel that they can experience a similar life in a small city, and Guwahati by no way it's not small in terms of northeast geography, but it is definitely small in terms of, Los Angeles and Bombay and Delhi. So this kind of bridging to be able to, convince the grandchildren that there is life here and that life is not compromising on things that you enjoy elsewhere. So I think capturing those kind of tensions from different angles would be interesting as well.
I'm not sure I have much to add beyond that. I agree that this kind of idea of thinking about the qualitative terms of what is small is something that actually needs quite a bit more attention, because we have, little bits here and there, people claiming that it's small for reasons. I mean, I definitely anecdotally heard people say that, compared to Kolkata, life here is easy, or, unlike Kolkata, this issue of identity, I'm a small town girl, I'm simple, it was very often around women's behavior, but probably unsurprisingly, unlike in Kolkata where the girls do this, our girls act in the proper way, things like that. In West Bengal in particular, I didn't do very much time in Navsari, but it is in some ways typical of what you'd imagine in a kind of Gujarati city. It's very close to Surat, and so people often put it in opposition to Surat. It's a much quieter pace of life here. My husband, he works in Surat, but we stay here because it's a quieter pace of life. But it was also weirdly globalized in that you had the German bakery funded by the Gujarati NRI. You had really good pizza at the New York pizzeria funded by an NRI. You had a lot of empty houses because of this kind of huge Gujarati diaspora, which also then changed kind of the idea of what it meant to be small in Navsari now and what it meant to identify from that. But yeah, I would agree that you need a lot more attention to these kind of qualitative aspects of why people think of their city as small and what that means for their life and how they identify.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I got the similar question of why did you come here? Why did you choose this place, such a nondescript place? What's special about here? That kind of, I got those reactions almost from everybody that I talked to and interviewed. But I also realized that apart from identifying as not Kolkata, in relation to like how they are different, there was definitely an assertion of, yes, we are urban, for sure. Even though many people did not know about this census town classification, they didn't know that they were a census town, but they definitely had this urban consciousness, where they definitely asserted this urban identity. But at the same time, a different kind of urban identity compared to Kolkata, also articulated along similar lines of what women can do and how strong social ties are, how strong family ties are, how apparently in Kolkata neighbors never speak to each other, that kind of thing. But there was also a very strong articulation of connection to the land and connection to the agrarian way of life. And one of the patterns I noticed was that in landowning families, usually the oldest son would be away employed in a formal sector salaried job, and the second or the third son would either make the choice or would be asked to make the choice to continue to live in the town, look after, supervise the farming, take care of the hired labor that does the farming. So they're not technically farmers, but they're agricultural supervisors, and they're very invested in maintaining that way of life. Because somebody said, we believe that you haven't really eaten a meal if you haven't eaten rice grown in your own field. And to continue to grow rice in your own field, you need people to continue to live there and farm the field. So I think there is definitely this dichotomy of what kind of affiliation people are willing to articulate. Yeah.
It's interesting to reflect on this in light of the whole planetary urbanization debates as well, that we're all urban now, that it's become so entrenched within our social lives. But in fact, you do still see this demarcation about I am a city dweller, they are from the periphery, they've come into the space, they don't behave in the way that they should in an urban context, this kind of thing, particularly in relation to gender. I think that's something else that's come up in Iona and my project in recent years. I think a couple more questions and then we'll break for lunch. Well, we've got about 4 questions. So we'll go Iona there, and then Tariq, and then at the back, and then Sanjay. Okay, 5 questions. And then
But I don't know if it's too much of a question or more of a comment and trying to bring it back to our project. I think, again, some of the discussions we had initially to think about smallness and how we are going to focus on conceptualize this was also the notion of time, and particularly in relationship to what being urban means, not just spatially, demographically, economically, but also in terms of identity. And your example was really perfect in that illustration. But also the notion of time, because we are thinking in our project about futuring, and how do small cities, how do cities think, or towns think about themselves in the future? What relationship does the past and the present have to the future? What relationship does the future have in terms of reconstructing a different sense of the past? And you often, and that's how I think the smallness becomes important, because if you aspire to a particular kind of future, you also begin to rewrite your past and begin to act in the present in a certain way. And we certainly wanted to think of it this way. And then the final other thing was about the notion of social inequalities. And one of the projects, my early projects in Malegaon, which is again a very small town, was to again, the aspirations for the future was a way of crafting a new kind of urban identity where anonymity that is present in a city would be given to them. And then that is not at the moment seen as possible in a small place, and it's also a small place equals to a parochial place. So there are quite a few tensions in terms of thinking about time and the flow between the construction of time between past, present, and future, which also I think would be useful for us to consider.
I'm glad that Iona brought back smart futures and this notion of the future, because that actually helps me to ask David on the notion that a small city or a small town will have a weaker government or a weaker city government, and that leads to a question of capacity. Sorry, and that leads to a question of capacities and. Can you start the question? Oh, I'll repeat the whole question. Yeah. So, to David, in your presentation, you had a point about small cities having weaker governments and that leading to weaker development outcomes in that sense. And my question actually is regarding the fact that another way to think or imagine the small city is also the fact that in terms of capacity and the geographical association of capacity, the fact that neither the state itself in terms of the city government or the fact that right now the smart city mission, very much like the previous flagship mission, the National Urban Renewal Mission, is a consultant-driven mission, and the notion is that all the capacity, the weak capacity of the state actors plus the stronger imaginations of the consultants are resulting in a completely different form of smart futures and a separate imagination, which is mostly in contestation with what people imagine their small cities as. And now coupling that with the fact that there are 100 smart cities and a huge influx of demand in terms of consultants and human resource requirements versus the actual realization that when all 100 proposals have gone through and some of them have been selected and things are moving forward, you just don't have the people to deliver. And those people choose certain cities, definitely not small cities. And by that choice, automatically you have another notion of which is a small and which is not. And what I'm trying to basically point out here is that there needs to be an imagination of, it's not just weaker government or weaker local connections, it's weaker linkages across geographies and then small.
And in the project, we do have this scalar approach, looking at the global, at the national, and at the local, how each of those scales is interpreting this idea of the smart city.
Thanks very much for all of the papers, which I really enjoyed. I just wanted to return to the question on Jugaad, actually, and push Srilata a little bit more, because I want, if we step outside the academic realm and how academics have kind of jumped on Jugaad in recent years, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to how, to what the relationships are in Indian public culture between the discourse of Jugaad and the discourse of smart, and how, I just wonder what that might tell us, thinking through how Jugaad is conceptualized in the context of planning for the smart city. So And yeah, that's it.
I think I was trying to rethink, like, so the connection between smart and urban. So if we've kind of sort of the direction this panel has taken, if you're sort of deflecting, let's say, the question of the urban itself to other sort of supplemental, more sort of empirical factors to local places. If you think of smart otherwise, let's say, which is not really connected to a particular kind of urbanity, let's say the smartphone, that seems to be like a supra-local sort of thing. I mean, I wonder if there is something urban to that itself, using a smartphone, or, I mean, if the access to smart in that sense. So if you're saying somebody from Gorbeta is, I mean, it's a census town which might remain a census town or might not remain a census town. But you want to think of how particular kind of urbanities are coming on to the populations. And then you think of, like, the use of the smartphone. And the smartphone actually, in the classic sort of modernist theories of urbanities, spectacle, alienation, etc., the smartphone can be used to kind of stream the spectacle of lynching, or can be used to for, like, micro-mobilizations, whatever. So I wonder if the smart itself, in that sense, is kind of, a kind of access point into the urban.
Lastly, Sanjay.
There's not much time, so you don't have to answer that. But I think the one is that, of course, there is literature around in terms of the qualitative aspect, but and again, it's not something that we'll be able to address. For example, I came across a recent book of short stories in Hindi. It's called Bolero Class. And Bolero is this huge vehicle. It is like a tank-like vehicle. And it's about small-town people coming to large towns and aspirations and class. So, how do you link class to ideas of consumptions, for example? Yeah, I think the land question is really important. Again, there's no need to answer it. I work in Gurgaon, and I find absolutely no... The most significant aspiration for farmers who haven't yet sold their land is to sell it as quickly as possible, buy more land, accumulate more capital, get their kids to private universities. And a similar process is happening in Western UP earlier, because it's a process of shifting from ideas of what is seen as a more backward notion of caste, but maintaining it to class. So lots of our people are de-ruralizing by moving to nearby towns, or Meerut, for example. So, I mean, I think it's important for us to think about it in this context, that, what do people make of the fact that they might be, as it were, inverted commas, losing their land. In places like Gurgaon, as I said, the people want nothing more than to quickly sell their land, buy more land in the sort of less fertile areas, and accumulate capital and become small-scale. I mean, you see examples of these small-scale farmers who became intermediaries for DLF, which are the largest real estate companies, and are kind of multi-billionaires simply because, and that's what they've convinced others to do. So I don't really see a sense of an organic connection, which is often some, anthropologists like me have a historical investment in ideas of people being invested in land. I'm not sure convinced anymore. There is no beyond capital. So.
On that cheerful note. And to the panel, lastly, any last thoughts or responses to those questions and comments?
Yeah, I'll respond to Sanjay first. I think the relationship between sort of the agrarian foundation of the Indian economy and urbanization processes, it's not homogeneous across the country, and it's very much, contextual and very much specific to the historical experience of agrarian life in many ways. So I think that's definitely, again, something that's it's very under-researched, and because we study cities so much in isolation, small or big, we don't always see the connections to rural and agrarian life and how much the two are interconnected. And Ananya Roy recently called it the necessary logic. The rural is the necessary logic of the urban in India. And I think I completely agree with that. I want to say something about the discourse of Jugaad and the discourse of smartness. Yeah, I haven't read much about the discourse of smartness beyond the idea that it is to do with digital technology and digitization. But I think the connection between the two ideas is basically in this idea of making something big out of something very small. So Jugaad comes into action when you have small resources and then somehow you put them together. You find a way to improvise on all of those small resources to make something big out of it, to build something big out of it. And then digital technologies, again, the discourse is that it's something that's in the palm of your hand, it's in your telephone, it's not something that's big and bulky and then you can make something big out of it. So I think that could be one of the sort of logical connections between the idea of Jugaad and the idea of smartness. But I also think if we kind of expand this idea of smartness beyond just digital technologies and take it to also mean, all the different ways in which people try to enrich their lives given the limited set of resources that they have or the limited infrastructural provisions that are made to them. If we expand the idea of smartness beyond that, then in many ways Jugaad is smartness. Like it's the original smartness, I would say. But I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, but I guess I was wondering if there's something more that might tell us about my evidence of developmental imagination woven into smart. So in other words, does smart seek to do away with the need for Jugaad?
Right.
So yeah, I think we will just let the panel and we'll have a break and we can continue the discussions after the break as well. So Natasha or David, do you have anything to add?
Just a couple of things. We spent 3 years arguing what was a small urban centre, what was an intermediate urban centre, whether we should use the word cities. In the end, we just made this pragmatic choice. Small urban centres are urban centres under 20,000 inhabitants. And they pick up most of the poor administrative towns and most of the small market towns. Intermediate urban centres, 20,000 to 100,000. Now, it's problematic because if you're working in India, an intermediate urban centre is kind of different from an intermediate urban centre in Rwanda. But we realised that these were completely arbitrary divisions and then structured a discussion around those. And of course, location and competence of government had more importance than size in the future trajectory of most of those urban centres. The other thing I just wanted to mention, it's wonderful to see this level of detail we're getting about small NGOs, small civil society organisations, and their importance in urban politics. But we've got to do that within informal settlements. One of the things that amazes me, and I spent a lot of time in informal settlements with federations of slum and shack dwellers, and they do so much more than we know, and they do so much more than we imagine, and they're so important. For instance, in many informal settlements in Mumbai, women have formed a community police, which works with the current police, it isn't outside of them, to get their settlements fully policed and fully patrolled. When I was in Mumbai a couple of months ago, a police commissioner took me to his police station and very proudly showed me around. And there was a small cafe run by the Mahila Milan, the Women's Slum Dweller Federation. So I asked, how did this come about? The police commissioner said, none of my police force wanted to go to informal settlements. They regarded them as outside the law, they were too complicated, you didn't want to take records, and you despised them to some extent. And as a way of actually instigating contact between the women federation leaders and the police force, you had this very successful cafe. And it was the place where police discussed with the women, what can we do about this, what can we do about that? And the women also having a key role in the responses. Now, I don't think anyone will disagree with me, but how little we know of the range and scale and scope and importance and political clout of these women's savings groups and all the other social clubs and sports clubs that they actually form.
Great, thank you so much, panel, and thank you so much for your questions and comments this morning. We will come back, I think, to many of these topics, especially what is a small city, the politics of small cities, the aspirations and identities associated with them as we progress today and tomorrow.